Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel and thank you very much for tuning in. This of course is going to be my final thoughts and sum up of my unfortunately rather ill-fated first try of Claws of the Tiger. So, initial thoughts, I like the game. As games of the Malaya Singapore campaign go, it's pretty solid. I like the fact that it plays quickly. I love the elements of bluff and double bluff that go into it. The combat system, when you first try to get to grips with it, is clunky. Most of the rules in this game are quite elegant. The reinforcement rules, the special campaign specific rules that help give you a flavour for the differences between the British and the Japanese side are very well thought out. I think the activation rule, where you have your set number of activations, which perhaps represents your army's level of doctrine and training, as these things tend to, the way in which that can be modified from turn to turn is a really novel and imaginative approach. And the designer doesn't say this, but I can imagine that that reflects all sorts of realities on the ground that commanders can't really cope with or do anything about. So it could be weather, it could be poor communications, it could be blind chance. It's beautifully done. More often than not, command and control advantage will rest with the Japanese, so these things tend to balance out. It's just that combat system. I see what the combat system is trying to do. It does it very imaginatively, but the combat system dominates the turn. And while you don't need a particularly good head for maths to get through it, there's a lot of modifiers to remember. It's easy to forget them. There's lots of stages to calculating your unit's firepower, and it just feels a bit heavy relative to the lightness and quick play of the rest of the game. Not that this is a bad thing. I mean, I think the combat system is good. Um, Initially, it just jars a bit because its style is quite different. At least I think so. But the results it returns are pretty decent. I mean, I didn't see the Japanese disaster at Kotabaru happening, but then you get that battle that took place in the vicinity of Kuala Krai, and that is fairly standard. I'll have to play the game a lot more, preferably with my cat in a different room, in order to get a sense of how the combat system balances out. There are a plethora of optional rules that give more historical detail and slightly impact the outcome of combat to give people that extra layer of realism if they want it. Otherwise, it seems quite a well balanced game. Both sides have an even chance at victory, which is nice. And as a bit of a bonus, I've not tried this yet, but I'd mentioned it in the first video. There's a very short extra sheet showing players how to play a solo variant where you take command of the ill-fated British defence and you spend the campaign basically firefighting, trying to stop the Japanese. I haven't tried it myself, as I say, but I've heard other people who have done say it's very challenging. You often feel the frustration, the constraints of your position, having to be strong everywhere in case the Japanese pull an absolute blinder on you, which of course is impossible. Sometimes you have to just indulge in a bit of mind reading and pray that you are right. Half the time you won't be, and you might see your entire position turned and collapsed. For the British player in particular, you've got some hard choices to make. The Japanese at the outset have the advantage that their forces are concentrated. They can choose where to place their strikes. They have that historical advantage that the British are left guessing, whereas the Japanese know what they want to do. The question is, how do they sneakily achieve it? The British, you could try a really solid forward defence, rush everything forward, but then you run the risk of being outflanked. Um, You could try to protect everywhere, but that's just an invitation for the Japanese to take you apart unit by unit. It is tempting to cede the whole northern half of the Malay Peninsula and concentrate a strong defence in the southern half of the country. But the rule about airfields punishes you, as it would have done historically for the British. Every inch of ground you give up without a scrap potentially hands more airfields to the Japanese. And not only is that vital for them in terms of winning their objectives at the end of the game, but after turn 2, the RAF in the basic game effectively ceases to exist. This is what happened historically. Within the first fortnight of the campaign, the Japanese Army and Navy pilots essentially tore the Royal Air Force contingent to shreds. And thereafter, despite reinforcements, even some Hurricanes that were delivered quite late in the campaign, British efforts at regaining air superiority or even air parity really came to nothing. The attritional exchange, even on good days for the British, favoured the Japanese because they could replace their losses much more easily than we could replace ours. And the speed of the campaign meant that any fresh planes we got had this sense of just being constantly on the back foot and on the run. So giving up territory is not necessarily a good idea for the British. It might make sense in a lot of other considerations, but it doesn't there. So tough choices. Of course, the British player knows he's having a really bad time if the Japanese are knocking at the gates of Singapore by the beginning of the February 1942 turns, which is basically 3/4 of the way through the game. So, yes, I think, aside from the awkwardness, I'll call it, of trying to get to grips with the combat system, and that will come after your first couple of plays, I really have nothing to complain about this game. It's a very novel approach. I've not seen an approach to the campaign quite like this one. I'm very glad it's part of my growing pantheon of games on the fall of Singapore, and I look forward to playing it again, but maybe not against my cat. In fact, not ever against my cat. Thank you very much.